Welcome to 7 UIs with Replicant, a series about making web frontends with Clojure and Replicant and functional programming. In this series, we'll be working through the 7 UIs from this website. This is a sort of a benchmark of sorts, whose aim is to highlight the developer experience and what it's like working with different toolkits. So it has 7 tasks that are designed in order of increasing complexity. And in this first episode, we'll start with this first one, which is the counter. It has this input field that shows a number and a button. When you click the button, the number should increase. We're going to solve this in 2 passes. First, I'll show you the absolute minimal effort you can put into making something like this with Replicant. And then we'll redo it a little bit to make it also viable. And then we'll end up with a minimal viable product of a counter, if that should be useful to you. Right. So this is where our setup left us. By the way, if you're interested in the technical setup of this project, there is a prelude episode that takes you through all of the details. So I'm going to skip over those today. Also, I'll be assuming that you have some knowledge of Clojure and will not be explaining Clojure basics in detail. This is the namespace that's being loaded. We now want to render something with Replicant. So I'll go ahead and create a source GUI's core single.js file. And here we'll require replicant DOM as R. And then we'll make a function, render UI. And then we can say render. You need a element, so we can use document body and then some hiccup. And this is basically how you get something on screen with Replicant. So now we can just go in over here and require the namespace. Put it in both of these. And then, boom, it says hello world. Very nice. Now for the rest of this exercise, I'm going to close the developer tools here and put the browser on the side and the editor on the other side so we can see the library loads happening. It's supposed to be a counter here. Let's add a div and we'll add some classes to it. A margin 8 to get some spacing around. And then we'll put the counter in the text here. Text large. And then we want to say here that we have number is, and then some number, 0 probably. And then we'll have a button that we can style like this. Count. Okay. So we can put this in a flex to get them side by side and put a gap in between. And also center them. Okay. So this is our basic UI. And now we need this number to increase. That means that we can't just hard code it here. We need to get it from somewhere. So we'll have some state. And I'll just make that an atom. Number is 0. Number. And we'll get the number from the state here. And then we need to make sure that this function here is called whenever this thing changes. How can we do that? We can do add watch. And this is obviously not going to be usable. I told you this is the minimal approach. The render, and it takes 4 arguments, and then we'll just call this render function like so. Now, you can see that if I go here and do swap on the state and say search number 1, it's going to render over here. So we already have this working, but it's supposed to happen when you click this button. So we can even do update number and inc. And then we can go down here and put a on click handler and just do this same thing. Now, if I click here, it's going to count. So this is like the very minimal example of making this thing work with Replicant. But I said that we were going to be doing functional programming. And here we have a DOM object, we have an inline function, we have global state, we have impure functions. And we were supposed to solve this with functional programming, so we don't want any of that stuff. So instead, let's just focus on this part. This is hiccup. This is, for the most part, data. So let's try to separate that from the less data-like stuff. So we'll create counter.cljc. Now, I'm very specific about naming this a cljc file because that's going to make it harder to use inline JavaScript and browser stuff, which it's going to encourage me to keep this file pure, as in pure functions. But we no longer have access to this global atom, but instead we'll just make it a map and have it be passed in. That's how you do data flow in pure functions. You pass stuff in and you return stuff out. We don't yet have any way to do this, so let's just comment it out for now. And this is our pure rendering function for now. Let's go in here and we'll do GUIs counter. And then we'll do render UI. And now we can deref the state and pass it in. So at this point, the number changed back to 0, but it's still rendering. The button is not going to work because we disabled the click handler, but we'll fix that soon. The next problem is that we have this atom just laying globally here, and this thing is kind of strewn in, so let's fix that. I don't actually want this state to be global. I want it to be centralized, but not global. So I'm going to take it away from here, and we'll go into the dev namespace where it can be global, because this file is not going to be part of my production build. So, but having access to it in development is useful, because then I can evaluate and look at the atom. I also like to separate, this is what I think of as the state, the current snapshot. This is a container that contains state snapshots over time. So I like to separate the names. Some people like this convention. Personally, for this specific use case, I like to call this the atom store. So we'll call it store and we'll pass it in here. And then we'll accept it on the other end. And oops. So this one, we don't have a solution for yet either. But we're still rendering. Next problem is, where do we do this? So I'm going to posit that we need to create another function called the init function, which also takes the store, which can do this. And then we actually, from the dev namespace, oh, sorry. I wasn't done. We now get the new state here that we can pass in there. And now we don't need to have the atom here either. And then for this to work, we're going to go here and change these calls to the init function instead. And that only almost works, because if I reload the page now, nothing's happening. And the reason is that this function sets you up for rendering, but doesn't trigger any rendering. So one way to do that would be to just call the function from here. But another way that I like is to do a swap and say, we were loaded at, and then we'll do get time from a date object. Let's just have a timestamp for when the UI was loaded. So now we render again, and if I change any of my code, it gets reloaded, which is very nice. So the only remaining problem now is this click handler. Replicant has a feature that allows you to move this function. Let me show you. So you can do on, click, and then you can put some data. Hello. When you do this, Replicant's going to expect you to register a global event handler, and it's going to pass this data over to that event handler when this thing is clicked. So to do that, you'll do r set dispatch, which takes a function. The first function is some replicant data that we'll look at later. We can just do like that for now. And then you're going to have some event data. So let's just print it and have a look in the dev tooling at what's happening. When I click here now, when I click here, it says hello, hello, hello. So now we have a way to communicate from this pure function to the part of the app that has access to all the impure stuff. And now we can convey the intention from here in a pure manner, and we can have the impure details kind of moved to another place. So let's just leave this here and try to imagine what that would look like. So what I usually do is I take a list of instructions, and you can call them actions or whatever. You can have like a tuple, and then the first keyword can be some sort of command. So I could say inc number. Now, if I needed to put arguments, I could put, this one or whatever. I could have arguments here, and I can have more actions down here. But for this one, we only need to increase the number, which is a action that doesn't take any arguments. So if I save this, click, it says GUI's counter inc number. Okay, so what can I do with this? Well, we're going to do a do seek, and then we get an action here. And actually, we get an action with some arguments. And then I can case on the action, and then I can say, if I received counter inc number, then I want to do what we did before. So now I have, once again, the impure stuff is in here in my little framework. Oh, it's a state. It should say store now. So count. Now it's working again, but this time my render function is completely pure, and it's well separated from the impure machinery. And this, I would say, is what I would call a minimum viable implementation with Replicant. You'll note that right now we have more impure code than we have pure code, and that's just because all we have is this silly little counter. But your app is going to be more advanced than this, and the good thing is that this impure stuff can support a lot of this pure stuff. And so hopefully by the end of this whole series, you'll be able to see that we'll be adding mostly pure code, and we'll be adding not so much impure code. So that's it for our counter example. In the next episode, we'll add some infrastructure to navigate between tasks before we attack the next task. Thank you for watching, and hope to see you again next time. Bye-bye.